Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Barry Rabe. Barry is the Arthur Thurnau Professor of Environmental Policy and the J. Ira and Nicki Harris Family Professor at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy, both at the University of Michigan. He's also the author of 6 books, including Can We Price Carbon? And among his many awards, he was the first social scientist to receive a Climate Protection Award from the United States Environmental Protection Agency. And if that's not enough, Barry is also a former Wilson Center Public Policy Fellow. Barry, great to see you. Thanks for joining us.
John, thank you so much for inviting me back. Always good to be with you.
And so, Barry, your new article, Carbon Pricing Enters Middle Age, is just posted to the Wilson website recently, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And I thought we should begin maybe with a little background for the uninitiated. Could you give us the definition of carbon pricing?
Sure. Carbon pricing, John, really refers to a couple of different tools, policy tools that can be used by governments to increase the cost of using oil, natural gas, coal, where there is an embedded carbon content, and the use of that commodity contributes to climate damage. The thinking is you elevate the cost, you discourage consumption, you encourage pursuit of alternatives. That can take the form of a straightforward tax known as a carbon tax generally on the carbon content of fuels. It can also take the form of something known as cap and trade or emissions trading, which allows markets to work in some flexibility, but still through the auctioning of so-called carbon allowances, without getting too technical here, allows for that same kind of a pricing mechanism to work. Bring the two together. Those are two tools that we generally think of as carbon pricing that allow a kind of market reaction to work rather than government regulatory strategies or subsidies or incentives, other tools to try to deal with climate change concerns.
And Barry, how long has it been around? I have to say, it seems relatively new to me and in my consciousness, but then I see your title, it's in its middle age.
That's right. And the thinking for this really comes from the discipline of economics. I say that as a card-carrying political scientist, not an economist. For many decades, arguably generations, economists have been thinking about this to deal with so-called negative externalities, pollution, other kinds of things that we want to get rid of or minimize in society. Its application to climate has been kicked around for at least 40 years. And some of the early experiments on this, these were Nordic nations developing straightforward carbon taxes over 30 years ago. So the idea has been around a very, very long time. In actual policy terms, we're talking about a few decades.
So even before our harshly polarized times where everything is black and white, even before then, this is a policy initiative that suffered from that sort of bipolarism, right? It's either the silver bullet that's going to solve the problem, or it's a non-starter. In its middle age, where does it live in that regard?
Well, that's right. And John, I actually have talked about this in my earlier book, as you mentioned, and come back to it in the new paper. There was a lot of anticipation, certainly economists, but others, that one might address the climate change challenge by creating a very rigorous, robust set of carbon prices that would be set up amongst nations, but globally, and that would really drive the changes that needed to occur. In reality, for a lot of political reasons, that has been hard to achieve in many cases, certainly in the United States. But what I discuss is sort of carbon pricing in middle age is kind of a patchwork quilt, a mixed pattern. The US carbon price remains zero. But when we turn to a good number of other nations, they're really actively developing their own carbon prices, making it part of their climate strategy. And we've begun to see this for other greenhouse gases as well, like methane, where the pricing aspect is there, but it's one of a series or a suite of tools rather than the only thing that you do to try to address climate change.
So talk about some of the obstacles to broader implementation. You mentioned politics just now. I'm guessing fossil fuel industry resistance. What are some of the main obstacles that have come into play as nations have attempted to roll out this strategy?
Sure. Politics and climate change go hand in hand. And when you begin to raise the prices of common legal commodities, gallon of gas, heating bills at home, and so forth, or in your businesses, that triggers concern. In some cases, opposition. Why are those prices going up? And what can we do to prevent or block or to reverse that? But you also have strong embedded interests that oppose any possible threat to the production of oil, production of gas, to the production and use of coal, or industries, in some cases transportation, perhaps labor unions, that have basically created a very secure economic base for themselves by using this product that may be legal to produce and use, but causes environmental and climate damage. Threatening those established interests in the United States or elsewhere can combine to create a real limitation on what some of these prices have been able to do thus far.
Can you describe a bit more of what you described, what you called a patchwork quilt? Where has this been implemented? Where has it gained the most traction? And what are the best results that have been seen so far for the nations or groups that have implemented this?
Right. So we really do see these kind of asymmetries in whether the tool is used or used very much or used more robustly. Perhaps not surprising, since the actual development of this carbon pricing tool began in some of the nations of Europe, the Nordic nations that I mentioned a moment ago. It really is the European Union that is leading the way on this through what's called ETS, or an emissions trading scheme, created almost 2 decades ago, struggled initially, but has now become quite a robust tool. Over the last couple of years, prices have averaged between 80 and 100 euros a ton, which is quite high. And the scope has begun to expand from initially focusing on things like electricity into other sectors. And as Europe has kind of led the way globally in developing policies and setting ambitious targets and looking at how these operate, the ETS has increasingly been a central portion of what it does. Other cases that are really quite significant in the United Kingdom, despite the nasty divorce of Brexit, this is one case where the United Kingdom and the rest of Europe have actually been working cooperatively and worked together. We also see examples of this from Asia, which we could discuss, but I think a particularly interesting one in North America involves the American neighbors in Canada. Like the US, a very fossil fuel intensive country, and having struggled for a long time to think about how to begin to deal from a policy standpoint with climate change. There's something in play across the American border called the Pan-Canadian Framework, which applies a national fee or charge on fuels, and then province by province, territory by territory, has another mechanism in place for industry. Combined, has actually begun to create a fairly robust price with aspirations to get to much higher targets by the end of the current decade. And so if you look at those three together, that represents about 40% of American trade. The American price remains at zero, but you can look at these three major entities that all have developed pretty robust systems, with now discussion and debate in many places around the world whether to kind of emulate the American path or go the route of Europe and some of these other nations.
Where there has been robust implementation, has it been worth it in terms of the solution to the problem? Are there measurable results that are compelling that might encourage others to attempt the strategy?
Yes, I think until just a couple of years ago, there was, legitimately so, concern that many of these prices were still pretty modest. There were lots of exemptions and exceptions, and so the impacts were quite modest, maybe a percentage reduction a year or even less than that in some cases. What's a little less clear, in part because this increase in price and increase in robustness has really occurred more in the last few years, to know that with some degree of certitude. There are, some studies from some of the nations that have developed their own robust prices, and even the EU, which suggests a fairly significant level of reduction. But again, it's not the only thing that the Europeans are doing, and so I would not want to suggest that the only driver there is this ETS system. I think going forward, one of the really, really interesting questions is beginning to look at all of these systems much more carefully, but particularly when the bar is set higher, there's a much more ambitious target and it's maintained for several years. Then what kind of reduction do we see, much as we need to do with other kinds of policies or policy approaches?
Yeah, there's no one size fits all or magic bullet or silver bullet. You raised the issue. We've already talked about political feasibility, and that's uneven depending on which country you're looking at. You also raised the issue of durability in your piece. And you mentioned that the EU model initially struggled, but it seems to have gained some traction and ballast. Can you talk about durability in terms of, is there a best practice out there? Is there a roadmap that suggests this is the way it would work best over the long haul?
Right. And durability becomes a really important area in climate policy, certainly for carbon pricing, but also other policy tools, because many things that are often tried in the US, often through executive actions or even initial proposals, don't necessarily last. And in something like carbon pricing or other climate policies, you want to be able to send very clear signals to citizens, to the economy more broadly, that this is going to be in place and is going to endure and to be durable. So this is a really significant challenge. Here again, I would point initially to the European Union, the ETS, and a number of steps that have been taken there, in part because so many of those policies have actually endured election cycles, changes of leadership, and the like. I think this is an issue that we've really struggled with, in contrast, much more in the United States. At one point, 12 or 13 years ago, 23 states had adopted some version of their own carbon pricing systems, the East Coast, the West, and even here where I'm speaking in the Midwest. Now we're only at 14. We've actually seen a reversal in the last 10 years in the sheer number of states. Most of the activity lodged along the eastern coast and in California. That's an example of non-durability. And we've also seen that with resistance to other kinds of policies, including the fact that, almost everything that's been tried in the US under previous presidents, such as President Obama, have been then often reversed by subsequent presidents, namely Donald Trump, or the federal court. So this is a huge challenge for climate policy, not just getting support initially, but actually making it stick and making sure it works.
When a carbon tax is implemented, what generally happens with the revenue that's generated? Does it go into development of new energy sources? How is it used? In the past, whether it's been cigarette taxes or other things, we've seen that sometimes that money's been directed to public service campaigns. And is there any consistency to the way that nations who have implemented carbon pricing have used the revenue?
I would say what we're seeing is consistent change.
Hmm.
Ironically, some of those early Nordic taxes that I mentioned tended to concentrate a lot of money back into general revenues and general budget. A lot of thinking developed by economists suggested that the best way to do all of this, especially from an economic standpoint, is collect that money, but then give it back in the form of tax cuts, rebates that are roughly comparable, dollar for dollar, euro for euro. What has really happened over the last half decade, and this is a theme that I look at to a large extent in the paper, is that since my book came out in 2018, the growing trend has been to collect that money through a tax system or cap and trade, but put it into a fund that then supports directly some form of green transition, increased energy efficiency, support for renewables. The Europeans have been spending a lot of time and money sort of shifting revenues toward energy efficiency, and from nations that have greater wealth to nations that have less wealth. So there's an interesting redistributive aspect to this. The last 2 years, 2021 and 2022, we have evidence that the majority of collectively around the world carbon pricing revenues are going to that energy transition rather than every other non-energy purpose that one can envision. That seems to be an enduring trend. It's interesting that you had mentioned the tobacco case, because we do see, certainly in the United States, examples of using things like taxes on cigarettes, alcohol, but also even things like labor and Social Security, where you have a tax and create a fund, namely the Social Security Trust Fund, that politically can build support. We can raise, questions about how money should be best used from an economic standpoint, but politically that seems to register in the public imagination. And actually, survey work, particularly from the European Union, suggests that that is the most consistently popular way that the public would support a carbon price if they knew that's where the money was going to be spent.
Hmm. So the President Biden and others have touted the Inflation Reduction Act as the largest climate bill ever passed. As one of the things, the maybe, well, I should say intended consequences, not unintended consequences of that legislation. Does it address carbon pricing in any way?
It does not. What becomes very interesting there is that Joe Biden, who has supported carbon pricing both as a senator and then as a vice president, pivoted away from that in part because of the political issues and concerns that we raised earlier, which are significant in enduring in American politics, and took the IRA ultimately in a very different direction. And that is to take revenue drawn more from general tax sources and use financial incentives and subsidies on a very, very large scale. Somewhere between 360, but by some estimates, up to $1 trillion may ultimately be spent in this area over the next decade or so. Now, that reflects very deep American pockets and the fact that there is a large base, and there was a really interesting window of opportunity there. And so the US IRA experiment becomes an incredible test of whether that kind of incentive or subsidy approach without a carbon price, keeping in mind that the American carbon price remains at zero. Developing complementary or supportive regulatory programs is hard to do in Congress and may be challenging in the current court situation. This is a subsidy or incentive-based approach. And we use subsidies and incentives all the time, but we've never seen this globally. And so it does represent an important direction and shift. I would say, though, even within the IRA, when we begin to turn to some of the other greenhouse gases, there you do see uses of taxes or fees or charges that basically have the same effect. That's certainly the case in methane, and it creates an unusual situation whereby the United States is now the only member of the G7 that has a zero carbon price, does not have any price nationally on carbon, but it has now become the first member of the G7 that has a fee or a tax on methane released and wasted at the site of oil and gas production in early stages of its development. So even there within the IRA, this vast bill, it's primarily incentives and subsidies. In a couple of significant ways, there have been ways to bring this sort of the same kind of logic, if you will, of a pricing tool, John, but they apply it to another greenhouse gas. In chemistry terms, CH4 or methane rather than CO2 carbon.
So, Barry, I'm sure you talk to many more than I, but when you talk to climate, those who are advocating for climate action, a lot of frustration because there's a sense of being on a treadmill and running but not getting anywhere. And one of the things you write in the conclusion of your piece is that more than a quarter century after the arrival of the Kyoto Protocol, relatively few nations have achieved significant climate mitigation progress. Continues to be a slow-moving train, but a fast-moving phenomenon. As you look ahead, is carbon pricing part of the equation, or is this an attempt that just never reached fruition?
I think it's a mixed bag, and I think you're right, John. You know, we've been at this climate policy business in the United States and globally now for a long time. Kyoto more than a quarter century ago. And I'm not sure that we have found a single policy bullet that in any nation has just resolved or achieved deep decarbonization in a rapid way and maintained political support. I do think there are lessons from nations, most notably, frankly, members of the European Union, but even a few American states, where you do see some creative blending of policies, not reliance on one tool or one approach, but bring these things together. And I do think the case, especially from some of the Northern European countries here in Europe, is an interesting one because they have a significant carbon price, but they also have regulations, incentives, and subsidies. It's hard to design these and maintain them, but we can actually begin to see, at least in some jurisdictions, and this is also applicable to some extent in some places in North America, you can achieve some advances and gains. And yet, to do that on a much broader and larger scale, especially given the global dimensions of this, even the United States creating a significant reduction in its own emissions, has relatively limited global impact unless there's some way then to share all the technology, the wealth, the expertise that's been accumulated in the US with other nations in the world. And so this is a problem that is just far more complicated than just pulling the lever and bringing down emissions in one state, one province, and one nation.
Well, Barry, we can't predict the future, and we're not in the business of advocacy. But certainly, if anyone wants to continue to follow and understand these issues, Barry Rabe's the guy. I mean, Barry, you've done remarkable work in this area over the course of your time, and you're still at it, and you've been recognized for it. Thank you for joining us today and for sharing your expertise.
Absolutely. My pleasure, John. Good to be with you.
And I should also tell our viewers, Barry, that if they'd like to see more at wilsoncenter.org, if you click on the programs tab in the Environmental Change and Security Program and the WABA Institute for Strategic Competition, you'll see the paper that we've been talking about today that Barry has published and written, and also a recent event that Barry did at the Wilson Center with other people on the panel and more on this topic. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll be back again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for your time and interest.